Hello everyone and welcome to today's webinar. We have a great session lined up for you today. Before we get started, there are just a few general housekeeping points to cover. First and foremost, please use the online question tool to post any questions that you have, and we will share them with our speakers. Second, if you experience any technical difficulties today, please use the same question tool and a member of our admin team will be on hand to support you. And finally, just to note, this session is being recorded and we'll be sharing a copy of the recording with you via email in the coming days. So without further ado, I'd like to hand over to our speakers to get us started.
Thank you very much and welcome everybody to our session today. The introduction to this year's HKA CRUX Insight Report titled Forewarned is Forearmed, Anticipating Challenges, Mitigating Risks. And we will get right into the crux of the materials here by dispensing with the usual biographical details. Rather, I'd like to introduce the roles, which you're welcome to look up. These are all very well-known participants in the world of construction and engineering in various roles, but just to lay out the roles that people and perspectives that they will provide today, I'll just quickly go around and introduce those perspectives. So Caroline Pope, we have here today, is providing the view, as she is, of the counsel, the expert in construction and engineering cases. John is the employer perspective, and will speak about keeping with how to develop projects and the desire and what you can do to try to keep them on track and get them delivered on time and within cost. Daph is the role of the front-end strategic advisor, providing support to folks like John, making sure that your projects get off on the right foot. And Michelle, who will be here providing the perspective of the expert in delay and scheduling, as you'll see, continue to be hot topics in this year's CRUX report. And I'd like to also make a fifth introduction, which is the CRUX report itself, which is I would draw everyone's attention, actually, if those of you can access it, to one among the last pages, the methodology, because the report is actually a quite remarkable collection of information from actual HKA projects in which HKA has been involved, providing advice and looks at the causes of claims and disputes around the world and what's happened over the past year, but also correlated with peer-reviewed publications around the industry. Michelle, if you could just give us just a quick 1-minute overview as to how the information was gathered for the CRUX report, and then Daph will, I think, provide us some of the highlights of what's in it.
Well, thanks, Michael. Yeah, I think in terms of how we define causation factors within CRUX, I think it's useful to know that how we came to those causation factors was comparing taxonomy across 57 different peer-reviewed academic publications. And this produced a list of 1,750 causes of construction and engineering claims and disputes. So we did a detailed mapping exercise on that, and we condensed that list down to 50 definitions of causation factors. That was then reviewed by the HKA experts and shared across all the different regions, which led to a further refinement. So we came up with an updated list of 38 causes of claims and disputes. And what we then do as a company is, when a project is finished or completing, we have a document that we fill in, and we have these drop-down boxes of 38 different causation factors. And the standard form basically includes things like the project type, the sector, the subsector, our involvement, whether it was dispute, whether it was during the course of the project, original contract period, original contract price, and the list of causes and the list of disputes. So that's really how we gather that data, and there's a massive amount of data that, as a company, that we're sat on, that then leads to this CRUX report being produced every year. So over to you, Daph.
Terrific, thank you very much. It's real world data. It's an amazing, yes. So Daph, tell us about what a highlight or overview of what this data tells us this year. Why are we forewarned?
Yeah, thanks, Michael. Thanks, Michelle. So if we can just move to the next slide, please, Sandra. It's got just a few of the kind of key facts and figures from the underpinning data. And as Michelle said, there's a fairly rigorous methodology to go through to actually work out, you know, what are the key themes and trends that we're seeing. And the data lake we've got is pretty rich, pretty deep, and it's 6 years data from 6 years prior to August 2023. And as you'll see here, that this year's CRUX report is a really rich and deep source of information. So you've got over 1,800 projects that have been analysed, over 100 countries, and more than $2 trillion worth of capital expenditure. So it's a really big, meaty sort of amount of information. And I guess the slightly depressing element is the fact that if you look at the data, there's extensions of time equating to 875 years and $91 billion worth of additional costs claimed. So you get a really interesting snapshot of the state of the industry just by looking at the data. So then if we go forward, to sort of set the scene for this morning's discussion, is that those of you who have seen previous iterations of the CRUX report, if you look back on the 2022 report, it made quite a few arguments, but the two sort of primary things it argued was, firstly, for a closer, more constant management of scope throughout the project lifecycle, and secondly, greater investment of time and resources up front in the pre-construction planning phase to develop designs and scope as far as practical before starting work, so planning to succeed rather than rushing to fail. And in most regions that our analysts and our consultants have worked on these projects, that on these fast-track programs, there's been apparent gains being made, which have been largely undone by scope and design immaturity. So that's a really big causation. So when you start to look at the 2023 data, what you see is the same story repeating itself again, which is scope change again tops the list for our global rankings. Now, that's not the true story in every region, but by and large, by primary causation factor, scope change is number one. And what's really apparent from our analysis is it's becoming increasingly evident how design failures drive project distress, both directly and in conjunction with changing scope. So if you look at CRUX's 3 design-centric factors, which are incorrect, late or incomplete design information, they're clustered within the global rankings top 5 causes. And so then you further analyze that, and it reveals that there's this kind of design triple whammy, which has impacted a greater proportion of projects overall, 45% almost, than scope change alone. So actually these kind of design factors, when they're compounded, are really the kind of the key causation of project distress. And so if you look, when you dive into the 2023 report, you'll see that there's obviously a general increase in claims relating to COVID-19, price inflation, materials and labour, and the war in Ukraine leading to supply chain issues. But these are hopefully temporary blips. And so when you go back into the core data, is you see that the key issues and risks that we see in 2023 are pretty much the same as we saw in 2022, which are pretty much the same as we saw in 2021. And so they may as such be variations on these timeless themes. So the basis of the discussion is, why do we keep making the same mistakes, and what can we do about it going forwards? So I'll hand back to you, Michael.
Great, thank you very much, Dan. So, John, you've been forewarned from an employer perspective. Are we doomed to repeat the mistakes of the past, or are there things that we can do, or do you have examples that you can share of things that you are doing today to keep projects on track, to get them done? By the way, I would note that the CRUX report also provides some indications of where likely growth is going to be in the coming years. So there's some, for example, a 3 times investment in energy and renewable projects by 2030. So I mean, really, it's where are you thinking these days in terms of planning, organizing, and getting projects off on the right foot?
Yeah, thanks, Michael. So, where we see the market going at the moment, and we've got, the CRUX report is clear, and what it's saying is we've got to look at alternatives. And there's several alternatives globally that people have used in terms of alternative delivery and contracting strategies. And one of those is focusing more on the collaborative behavior, whereby you erode the sort of historic employer-contractor relationship and actually work together to find solutions and be solutions focused. And picking up from what Daff had said earlier and getting in at the front end, I think the buzzword at the moment is ECI, which is early contractor involvement, but really understanding what does that mean and what is an early contractor involvement to make sure that that you get the most effective and efficient team working together to drive an outcome. I think the second part to that is the delivery strategy and the contracting strategy post the ECI, and is that, you know, managing contracting, is it, you know, some kind of open book, controlled open book target cost model, potentially with incentives, and how those incentives work, and for everyone have, you know, being collectively involved in the success of the project. And I think, you know, what all employers want, as does contractors and all stakeholders of the job, is certainty of delivery, and not projects that that get locked up halfway through because there's disputes, there's changes that can't be dealt with, which means the time, the schedule gets pushed out, the costs increase, and no one wins in that situation. So looking at alternative ways to do that is really important, and spending more time up front, whereby you can really invest in making sure the design is correct, making sure that everyone's clear on what their scope is, making sure that, you know, all parties can work together and you're both aligned on a common goal to reach a successful certainty of delivery.
But you know, you also mentioned that when we were discussing and preparing for this today, you know, this notion of having everybody with in shared uniforms, right, where everybody has their same logo. And you know, as a practical example of one of the things you're doing, how does that fit with, you know, what you say about getting early contractor involvement and engagement and collaboration?
Well, I think, you know, Michael, picking up on that, some of that is around co-locating teams, and that is that, so they're working together at the ECI stage, and it's not, they're not all sitting in different offices to actually thrash out issues and find the best solutions and actually capitalize on opportunities. And some of the ways that can be done, and I've seen in that we're looking at as well, is, you know, everyone's got the same uniforms, as you said, you know, and you've got your name on your uniforms, including pants and shirt from a safety perspective, but different logos. And it's sort of, acts as a way to break down barriers, you know, focusing on what is important, you know, as an outcome to both parties. So where completion date may not be the taking over certificate is, the employer gets their project with 10,000 snags. The taking over certificate is linked to opening whatever asset you're developing, you know, and driving a common goal there to, you know, through financial incentives, but also through, you know, successful delivery.
Thank you. And I was going to ask Caroline, I wanted to ask you, yeah, please.
I was just going to comment on, I'm almost going back to what David said and what John said, because it is quite interesting that we've got, you know, 39% of causes identified as scope change. And when we think about scope change, and certainly when acting on the claims that I've been involved in, scope change is usually driven by employers kind of changing their minds as the project develops, ideas come through. And in a sense, picking up on what John says, it's just such a shame that that is leading to a cause of dispute, because really, if the contract's being properly managed, that those should be being dealt with as they occur. The time consequences, the cost consequences should be being dealt with. And I think it's a real shame that more employers don't become more prepared to probably put their hands up and acknowledge that the scope change is very often led by them and not because of any fault on behalf of the supply chain.
Can I chip in there, Michael? I think I agree with what you're saying, Caroline. I think there's almost a suggestion that sort of clients change their mind for the sake of it. And I think there's a sort of underpinning factor there, which is more often than not, and certainly the projects I've worked on globally, is that the projects are set up to fail before they've even started, which is there's this really arbitrary date that the project has to be delivered by to tie in with an election cycle or a ministerial commitment or whatever the factor may be. And so the project's announced, the timeframe's announced, and then the project team has to work out how the hell do we deliver it within this timeframe. So they're running to fail before they've even got started. And I think this is the ability to, you know, I think it starts with the clients to sort of, how do you go slow to go fast? And every time we have that conversation with the clients, they're like, oh, no, we haven't got time to think properly. We've just got to get on and do things. And, you know, the data that's on the screen at the moment tells the story, which is actually, it does make sense to take a breath and think about your project properly before you start going. And you've got a fighting chance, because the projects we're all working on are big and gnarly and complex and massive in scale, and they're getting bigger all the time. And if you're just going to keep on running to try and you get stuck in the same vicious circle, which you keep on changing scope because you have to, because you haven't had time to think about it properly.
Yeah, I completely agree, and it was very interesting. There's one paragraph hidden in the CRUX report that gives the anecdotal evidence about the fact that actually during the pandemic, a number of projects were slowed down or were put on hold, and that on those projects, the design issues arising later are well down on the normal percentage of causes of delay. So by about somewhere between 12 and 16, 17%, which is quite a big reduction. So yes, it's about time. I mean, Dr. David Mosey says, you know, fail to plan to fail. One could say fail to design is to design to fail. I mean, I think that is probably the key thing. And time, as we keep saying, is the overriding factor, because it's not just the design process, but it's involving, as you say, David, and John says, it's the supply chain. It's so important. Increasingly, tier 2, tier 3 contractors have an enormous element of design responsibility, and how do we ensure that it's the interfaces? And I think it's interesting that interface hasn't actually been identified as a cause of delay, but in my experience, actually design people think is actually caused by interface problems and more time. And I hate to say, another really interesting comment is design is something we can control, both parties control. And John, you know, as employer, it is, you know, in a sense, your responsibility to the project and its successful delivery could be ensuring that more time is given up front to allow that design process to go through.
Yeah, I'd just like to add to that also, Caroline. It's not just the design process with the consultants doing it in isolation. It's actually, we recognize bringing the contractor in and the supply chain, as you say, to actually influence the design, to make sure that it's the most efficient design, to make sure there's constructability within that design and it can be actually built, and, you know, alternate methods of construction can be adopted. And it's, you know, we need to recognize that to de-risk the project, but also make sure that, you know, everyone is set up for success.
But, you know, and I'm going to ask Michelle to jump in here, because I think HKA, of course, sits on, as experts, will sit on both sides of the project here. And the CRUX report, though, does spend quite a bit of time about not just design or early design, but if you look at the different headings of the causes, many of them have some connection with design. In fact, there's an interesting term that I'd never heard before, which was design immaturity. And as Carolyn points out, and the report as well makes the point, that design is something that's within the party's control. So let me ask, what are you seeing in practice? Or how would you articulate as to, in particular, what can be done differently or better to avoid or better manage the claims and disputes that arise?
I think it's an interesting one, and it's a challenge that the business has had for a long time. I mean, just to mention, probably 20 years ago, we were working on putting plans in place to help contractors and developers up front, because we could see 20 years ago we were having exactly these problems. So we designed a suite of services to go out to contractors and developers to say, look, we can help you up front, because we can see there needs to be early involvement, not just us as specialists, but from the contractors, from everybody, to get everything right at the beginning. And we went out, not just in Europe, but we were based out in Hong Kong as well. And you know what? It wasn't taken up by one single contractor or one single developer 20 years ago. And we were even going to one particular manufacturer who we'd worked with continuously over 10 years and said, look, we've got a lot of lessons learned for you, because we see these problems happening time and time again. We're coming to do some lessons learned for you, and perhaps on this new project that you're setting up in the UK, we can help you up front. And what came back to us was, don't worry about it, we won't have this problem on this job. 3 years later, they were phoning us up saying, we have got these problems, please come in and help us with the claims. So my biggest concern here is actually there needs to be a fundamental change in behaviours from the people that are working on these projects. And we need to have the right people on these teams to identify that these issues happen time and time again, but we need to do something about it. And I think it's about getting the right people with the right behaviours on these jobs, because nothing's changed. I've been in the industry over 30 years. Nothing's changed so far. I know that isn't a solution, but I think it comes down to human behaviour. We've got to do something and make some changes there. And I know some of the others had some thoughts on this as well.
Before we get into skills, which is I think we'll touch on separately, and I think it's another topic that the report spends a lot of time talking about, the skill shortage and getting the right types of skills. But I guess what I'd love to hear from some of you is in practical terms, what could the parties do different, whether in contracting or operational organization? I think John provided one example, like having people actually feel part of the same team. I mean, give them the same uniforms. What else can you do in terms of, before we get to assuming that we have access to the right people and the appropriate skills, some examples of things that are being done differently to bring projects closer in on schedule and within the budget?
Well, right, I'll jump in if I may, which is, so I think it's almost this throwaway comment, is provided we have the right people with the right capability and skills. I think that's fundamentally why these projects are delivered by people ultimately. And as Michelle says, we've all been in the industry for a long period of time, and we're seeing the same thing happen over and over again. And so it says there's something fundamentally broken. And I think that there's contributing elements which are, clients, there's inherent distrust between employers and contractors. They both think they're trying to do each other over. And so then that leads to some questionable practices during procurement and contractors underbidding work, and then leading to this kind of perpetuating of claims. And I think if there's almost like this important symbolic shift that employers need to drive, which is actually we're trying to get this win-win outcome that John was talking to, which actually we're clear on as an employer. We want to get our project on time, on budget, and safely delivered. And contractor, you want to get some profit and you want some certainty. And that's the relationship. And if everyone knows that's the relationship you're getting into, then you start to procure based on fit rather than just on price. And I think what I've seen more often than not is all procurement is a race to the bottom. The projects that we've seen go really, really well is where money, frankly, isn't the constraining factor. That's not to say it's a blank check, but actually you're thinking about what's the outcome you're trying to drive. So if you actually, there's this philosophical shift that needs to happen in all parts of the ecosystem to have a chart, and then you can think about what does a delivery model look like. John's talked about early contractor involvement. We're living and breathing that right now, and it's not a new thing, but it's amazing what there's so many people who haven't actually done it within the industry. So how do you coach this change? How do you actually get people to take up these new ways of working? And to Michelle's point is that we've known about this for a long time, and it still keeps happening. We still refuse to change. So we can come up with the right model for the right situation, but if you've got the wrong people in there and the wrong behaviours, then I think we're all on hiding to nothing.
So, John, procure to fit. You ready to? Is that something that resonates with you, or can we dispense with competitive bidding and just go straight to a collaborative model with contractors?
Look, I think it would be euphoria if we could, but we can't. And I think there's an element of easing it in. But what I think, as Daph said, human behavior, you've got to realize that when you're working together, it's not the client or the employer and the contractor. It's got to be, let's find the best solution and best for project. And if the contractor comes up with it or the employer comes up with it, let's find that to get that going. And I think, I've seen ECIs, as Daph refers to, work really well, and I've seen them work really poorly as well. And they take a lot of work, and it's not just technical ability of do your job and focus on that. It's also about how do you talk, how do you communicate with each other? How do you identify solutions early? And then how are you going to actually take that through to the execution phase? And I think if you are comfortable as a team, and when I say team, I mean all stakeholders together and bringing in the consultants, you know, and bringing in the contractor and the employer, and you're all comfortable, I think you can achieve some great results. But it's not, particularly where we are today, it's not an easy task by any means, and it is hard work all the way through from whether you're bidding a project and how you select the right partner, if you call it a partner, and how you actually then award and then take that through to the end of the ECI to say, yeah, we've really all achieved what we want to do. And by the way, if you perform the way you're saying you're going to perform, you'll make a really good return. But if you actually do exceptional, you'll make an exceptional return. And I think that's it's a big shift for a lot of organizations, a lot of people, but it needs to happen to get certainty of delivery, which is ultimately where we want to get to.
Thank you.
Can I jump in there? Because I think there has been a shift with use of with alliancing frameworks and effectively managed, by which I particularly mean that there is genuine flow of work of new projects coming through, that they can be quite successful because they do drive good behaviours, because people are hoping for the next project, and bad behaviours is probably one of the largest incentives, because historically one of the biggest causes it can be through design, through the whole long list of issues that one sees in the CRUX report, was the fact that there was a complete disconnect between the tendering teams in our big EPC contractors and the delivery teams. And I'm hoping that through early supply chain involvement and involving everybody in the way that John's describing, actually that is no longer happening, because all too often jobs used to be priced by in the UK we have estimators. I'm not sure other countries I think probably don't have them in the same type. But the estimators would price a job and come up with what they thought the program was, and then just hand it over and say, this is the price, this is the program, and it would go off, and they might win or they might not win, and then it went to the delivery team and they hadn't got a clue how they were actually going to do it. But I do think therefore that the alliancing, the working together, the early involvement of the full supply chain with all the key stakeholders, employer, consultants, and the supply chain, particularly on the very specialist supply and contractors, is absolutely key to that. So that's what I hope that we are beginning to achieve. And I think it has been successful. Sometimes it's not so successful, and alliancing in name doesn't work. As John says, it's got to be genuinely used to drive behaviours, and it's the employer who is best placed to knock heads together once he's selected his team to achieve that.
So can I just jump in on the alliancing point? And I think John might have the same view. That John and I both applied a lot of our trade in Australia over the years, which was really the home of alliancing. And on paper, alliancing is the perfect model. And for a while, there were some really, really successful projects from all parties' point of view in Australia through the alliancing model. And now alliancing is a dirty word. You can't dare propose an alliance contract in Australia because the model got exploited. And I think what we saw is that there's a lot of delivery models become in vogue and then go out again when they break. And I think what we see, there's an element of laziness, I think, sadly on the part of the employer, which says, well, these guys are doing an alliance, so we're going to do an alliance, and everyone's just sort of following suit. And actually what you need to do is work out what's the right model for the environment in which you're operating, rather than just blindly copying and pasting. So I think that there's probably a halfway house, which is alliancing works on the projects where it should work, and actually a lump sum design and construction contract works on some projects as well. So it's that really deliberate thought about what do we actually need to do in this situation, and then we've got a fighting chance. And John, I know you're going to say something about alliancing.
I could answer. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah,
John.
I think one of the other things that needs to be considered when looking at different delivery strategies and what you're going to select as an employer is how you drive performance from day one. And when I say day one, I almost mean from tender stage, when you're getting through it, all the way through to opening of the asset, because as you remember before, I didn't say handing over, it's opening together, and you celebrate. So you've got to select a model to actually drive that. And some of that is around incentivization. And the incentivization can work really well, provided that it's driving different behaviors and driving outcomes for all parties, right? So, you know, where people want to increase their bottom line, you know, you've got to incentivize for that. Where you need community engagement or various health and safety stats that we want to incentivize against, but also time and schedule. So I think it's really, really important to drive that, but that's only part of the equation, because that's almost the post-contract once you get through the ECI stage. It's how you actually make sure the ECI is the most effective it can be, and what is the metric that you can apply to that to say, yeah, okay, actually it got what we wanted, or it gained the other benefits as you get into post ECI into construction. Because if you don't, you won't know till the end of the project. And that is, you know, we truly believe in bringing the contractor and all stakeholders in the tent, so to speak, up front, and making sure that no one's there to game the model. Everyone's there to reach a successful outcome. And if you do hit the successful outcome, you'll have an outstanding return for all parties, including the employer, the contractor, and everyone involved. So yeah, that's my piece on that, Michael.
Thanks, John. Just for those who aren't that familiar with the CRUX report, ECI being early contractor involvement, engaging them in the process. And then I was just going to ask for Michelle to jump in here, because, you know, it's one of those things. I think everybody would like to say, well, of course, you know, we engage people early. Of course we do. Look, nobody starts from scratch, right? I mean, when you're pricing things, when you're tendering things, whether you're on the contractor or on the employer side, right, you have to know what it is you're actually bidding, what your costs are likely to be. So day one really isn't day one for anyone. Once the order, whether it's a purchase order or a bid that's been adjudicated, people are starting from some point where they've had a lot of information up front. So Michelle, what and you mentioned that you've tried to get people involved and accelerate. What is it different that they can do, assuming, you know, I think it's realistic, people do have that information. What more or what differently could they do? What does it mean, really, early contractor involvement, ECI, compared with the ways of the past?
Well, I mean, I don't have a huge amount of experience in this, Michael, to be honest, because we were never taken up on it. But what we were trying to encourage people to do was, even before they'd gone out to tender, is to go out and get involvement from the industry, from the contractors, etc. Because once they've already set that timeline, for example, for when they need to complete, once they've already set the budget, it's too late by that point. And as Duff's already said, they're already set up to fail. So, and it often is the case with certain projects that they're building, for example, the developer doesn't have a huge amount of experience in some of these projects that they're building. They might be one-off, for example. So they need to get more experienced contractors involved early on. So, you know, that's what really we were trying to encourage people to do. And also from, I mean, strictly speaking, because, you know, my background is planning and scheduling, is to get the schedulers involved up front, to be able to come up with different methods to be able to build the project so that they can save time, etc., and get other methods of working to be considered, so time savings can be implemented up front, which is going to save time and it's going to save money. But like I said previously, it's never really been taken up. We just didn't get any uptake from anybody within the industry who was interested in doing that. But then even after that, you know, we said, okay, well, we'll come on board to help you set up your processes and procedures to help you manage the projects better as well. We've had a little bit more success with that, but still not great success, to be honest, you know, with that. And having those processes and procedures better set up on the projects can help them manage their time and cost overruns much better. So yeah, I mean, that's just the small bit of experience that I have, Michael.
So I think, can I build on that, please, Michael? I think that Michelle's spot on. I think the early contractor involvement is, you know, there's a contract in place, and so therefore it already has consequences. And I think the very early contractor involvement, which is before the project's in kind of an embryonic state, I think is vital. And I think the very best projects I've worked on around the world have taken that, you know, what do we call it, industry engagement, market sounding stage really seriously, and I won't name the projects per se, but on the very, very big infrastructure projects around the world, where they've spent 18 months, 24 months just engaging with the industry in that business case development stage to say, actually, because what you want to do is when you go out to market to bid for these works, tender these works, you want to have a high degree of certainty about what you're going to get back. You don't want to open up the envelopes and have a surprise. So actually, this kind of whole spirit of co-development, of taking industry engagement, because you've got, from a client's point of view, you've got maximum leverage where everybody wants to be involved in your project. So absorb information, take ideas about how do you deliver your project better, how do you optimize it, what's the real delivery timeframe, what's the real budget, and actually both parties get the certainty then. And we've seen, around the world, really good take up from contractors who are happy to have a conversation when the project is a glint in the eye, because actually they recognize the more they add, the better their chance of success and the better chance of client success. And so I think starting these conversations as early as you physically can on the project is a really key differentiator between success and failure.
Great. But, I'd like to make sure that let's cover one of the other issues here, because I think this ties into a major issue that this report highlights, and that is, I'm going to use the S word. The S word being skills. If you look at the different headings of the top causes of claims and disputes in the project, as reported by in the CRUX report, you find that skills are ranked 13th and 19th in terms of the causes of claims. But if you combine them, it actually comes up, and depending on, you could actually slice and dice the report in different ways. It could be the second or third leading cause of disputes, if you combine just those two, in terms of the percentage of contributions of disputes. So, and I want to quote, and here I'm just going to read from the report, what I find a bit of a remarkable statement. It says, all regions face shortages of skills and labor to varying degrees. The desire for workforce localization and concerns around immigration limit employers' flexibility to draw on foreign workers. With an aging workforce, the construction and engineering industry struggles to attract homegrown talent, especially when more glamorous and high-tech sectors have greater appeal for young people entering the job market. The challenge is how to recruit, retain, train, and retrain the talent needed to sustain modern and efficient construction and engineering industry. Michelle, I'll come back to you. Since again, the report also highlights this as something that, to an extent, I would say to an extent, is within the party's control, right? How do we recruit and do that? But yet it paints a pretty bleak scenario in terms of, how do we actually expand the workforce that we're going to work with? So realistically, what can be done?
So I think, if I talk from personal experience, and I've got two areas here. One as a planner and a scheduler. The route to become a planner and a scheduler is not clear. There's no clear educational route to get there. There are no university courses that you can go on to become a scheduler or a planner. And it is a skill set that is highly in demand within the industry, and we're quite a rare commodity, I'd say that. And certainly as delay analysts, even rarer. But there are a few things that are being done amongst the industry to improve that. And there's a few courses out there, for example. So the AACEI, the American Association of Cost Engineers, now run a certified program for the PSP program, which is basically the planning and scheduling for planning and scheduling professionals. It's quite a short course though. So I think educationally, there is much more that the industry can do, I think, to be able to recruit people and upskill them. But I think something else that the industry really hasn't taken on board and needs to do more for is actually getting women into the industry. Like I said, I'm 32 years in the industry. When I first joined in the UK, the percentage of women in the industry was about 13%. Today, it's 15%. So we're 2% better in 32 years, which we're missing out on a huge amount of the population joining the industry. And I think there's a lot of reasons for that. I think that perception of the industry, I think it needs to change how it's perceived. And I think something else that the industry could do is basically to look at unconventional educational backgrounds, for example, and not just going the scientific route, for example, because really as an industry, What do we need from a lot of the individuals within it? Well, we need to be able to communicate well with each other. That is predominantly what we need to be able to do, communicate well and say what we need to do to be able to get there. So I think the industry is missing a little bit of a trick, and I think that we need to be really making sure that at the educational side of things, that the industry is recognised as a valid industry to go in there. It's a great industry to be in, let's face it. I mean, a lot of us have got to work in very many different places around the world on some hugely interesting and exciting projects. So I think we need to do better at basically saying it's a good place to work. But I think for me, you know, there are two things that we need to improve. We need to get more women into the industry, because sadly, let's face it, there's not many. Education needs to be improved, because then we will have better skill set, I think, and a better, clearer route for a lot of people in their education and how to get into the industry.
I'd like to ask, you know, actually, before I get to John, because I'd like to see John's perspective, what they are doing, given, because it does paint, I mean, a rather bleak scenario where there are some serious constraints, and you pointed to some great things that the companies might be able to do to address that. But I'd like to ask Caroline, I mean, Caroline, you know, in disputes themselves, are you seeing, is this just people complaining about we don't have the right people, or do you see this actually in the disputes that unfold and become major arbitrations or litigations, that really the core cause of those was the quality of the people who were involved, or the quality of the skill set that they brought to the project?
Well, I think if you add in from what we were talking about, if you also add in that nearly 20% of the causes are linked to contract management and administration failures and poor management of the supply chain and interfaces. Again, those are quality of individuals of doing their day job, and I'm afraid there are A teams, there are B teams, and there are teams that are far further down the alphabet than that, and we know that, and it's about training, it's about skills, it's about encouraging. It's about going into school, and start right at the bottom. It's about going into schools, pathways to construction. In the UK, a lot of all the main contractors now have got a very active program of going into these academies, talking to the 15, 16, 17, 18-year-olds and selling the industry. But we do have to we have to change the image. And in the UK, there is so much negative press around the Elizabeth line, the most unbelievably fantastic project, but it was just marred because it was delayed in bad press. It's HS2, it's the same. Is it going ahead? Is it not? Rather than looking at and making much more positive sales about what it means to be in the industry. The other thing we need to do is far more apprenticeships across the piece. And thirdly, I would say technology is going to play an ever bigger role in construction, inevitably. And so I do wonder whether it will actually either increase the divide between, I would say, those in the technology side of the industry and those who are not, or whether it will actually help raise the overall game. Because what we need to do is be paying people the right amount of money to encourage them to come in. At the end of the day, it's got to be an interesting job, but people have to be paid to do it and want to do it both because it's interesting and because they can earn a sensible living.
Great, thank you. John, in your reality, again, as I said, CRUX gives us a rather some serious and real world constraints on projects. I mean, and how in practice, how are you facing into those? I mean, first of all, are you seeing, does that resonate with what you see? And what are you doing in line of what Caroline and Michelle or other suggestions as to how to exercise some control over the recruit, the train, and the retain?
I think it's a huge challenge that everyone's facing at the moment, Michael, and particularly where you're in an overheated market and demand far outstrips supply in terms of projects that are coming on board and how quickly they need to be delivered. and obviously, you know, under budget, within time, and at high quality. So we're seeing a lot of that moving around. And I think engaging your teams is really, really important, you know, making sure that, you know, they feel part of an organization, and then they can do internal training to make sure that, you know, they continue to go up the curve and see and fulfill their aspirations, because, you know, jumping out of one frying pan to another often doesn't work. I think the other skills, how we're addressing some of the skill shortages and what we're seeing as well is looking at alternate construction methodologies, and this is to a certain degree technology, and taking labor off site, you know, and where we can have prefabrication or modularization. You know, it's got to be something that we look at in detail in this region, and I think that, you know, we've spoken about it a lot as an industry within the region, and I think it's time now to really encourage that. So we, you know, there's a lot of things that I think we can do around that. And then the third thing is, you know, upskilling the domestic market, you know, and it's a huge part in terms of what we want to do, what we are committed to, and what we will continue to do.
Can I just jump in on the point? I think Michelle's point is spot on, which is we've pretty much overlooked half of the population. And so if we're trying to solve a resourcing crisis, is why don't we unlock that? And we've done a lot of the work on this internationally, which says, actually, if you look at your career options, if you're a talented professional in an industry, would you really choose the construction sector? And the answer is probably not. It's pretty, you know, inhospitable conditions, either working outside in blistering heat or freezing cold. And the construction norms are, you know, 6 days a week and 12 hours a day. And so there was a study in Australia called Project 5, where they ran a project on conventional business hours, 9 to 5, 5 days a week, which was actually designed to try and get more women into the construction space. Because the reality is, like it or not, that women still seem to have the unenviable task of having to be a mother and a worker, and so therefore trying to work working hours more conventional in the construction sector goes a long way. And I think this is where we just need to make these powerful shifts, which is to make the construction sector less like the construction sector. If we can start to turn off all these really negative trends, then that's a good. Funny, I was having a conversation with someone about this last night. The construction sector seems to be fixated on learning lessons from the construction sector, and that's the mess we're in now. So why don't we look at these countercultural industries? How has automotives addressed its existential crisis? How's pharmaceuticals dealt with it? How have all these other industries addressed these challenges? Because actually the answer isn't within the construction sector. The answer is outside it, and we've got to make the construction sector attractive. So John's point about modularization and offsite, I think, is key. So solving a different problem, making the working conditions preferable, paying people a good wage. The answers are pretty blooming obvious, but everyone's sort of in the same conditioning, which is, well, let's just keep on repeating the mistakes of the past. It's eminently frustrating.
Well, let me take we have a question here from the audience, and I think this is relevant to what we're discussing right now. And it's from John Dye. It says, since behavior is fundamentally the same as it was 30 years ago, should large consultants like HKA be researching and developing AI solutions to remove the human shortcomings in the project development phase? Now, Michelle gave us a good example of how do we involve maybe humans that we're not tapping right now. But now that we've got these large language models that are not just getting better and better, you know, as I think Richard Susskind likes to point out, that the technology that we see today is the worst that it's ever going to be, meaning it's only going to get better from here. Might there, given that where you have a driver of large amounts in, you know, potentially in dispute or that could be in dispute, and these large language models, the generative AI, are you seeing, or do you think there is potential? John, you mentioned technology and using technology to implement these on the projects. And I'll just quickly tell you that this year I teach at Bocconi University in Milan today, where I teach legal writing. This year I felt it necessary to require my students to use generative AI in their some of their writing assignments. And I have to tell you that the result was more focus on legal issues. It's a legal writing class, less concern about wordsmithing, more creativity, and much, much higher productivity, meaning that my students could do things in 20 minutes, 30 minutes, that last year it was taking them an hour and a half. So are you seeing that creeping in, or do you think there's potential? I mean, what is the potential for that to address some of these problems going forward? Anyone?
If I can just jump in on that, because it is very much a hot topic at the moment. And I was out in the Dubai arbitration week, actually the week before last, and at the Society of Construction Law's debate at the end of the week, this was the topic. You know, are we going to see AI take over from consultants? And, you know, there was arguments on both sides of it, but I don't think we're there anywhere near close enough on regenerative AI to even be getting anywhere close to being able to use it yet, fundamentally on projects, to be able to take the work off of individuals yet, and certainly not on the dispute side at all. I think that there's a long way to go with that yet. But I mean, stepping back from, you know, regenerative AI, I mean, the industry itself, I think, is, from what I can remember a few years ago, is one of the worst industries with regard to taking up new technologies. I think it was at the bottom of the list with agriculture. And I think actually agriculture has now stepped over construction in terms of taking up new methodologies. So I think we've got a bit of a way to go before we even get regenerative AI involved. I think there's some other steps that we could be using, you know, things like drones, for example, for doing progress reporting, for example, you know, on some of these linear projects. I mean, there's a lot of other things I think that we could be adopting within the industry before we go the generative AI route. But I don't know if anybody else has got any thoughts on that topic.
There's absolutely an application for it, and it will take time because, as Michelle says, the construction sector is the laggard. But it's interesting, your point you was making at the start, Michelle, which is, you know, people know these things go wrong, they still used to learn the lessons of it. That's probably the application of AI, is the overlay. If you think about the application of AI to schedule analysis and actually thinking about what are all the what-if scenarios that could go wrong on this project from a schedule or risk point of view, AI is the obvious thing to apply that. So they might not take the advice from consultants about how do you repeat the mistakes of the past or avoid making those mistakes. But actually, if the AI provides that layer, I think that's probably a good way for it to go. So I think there's huge upside for it, but I just think there's a long way to go in Ireland.
It also feeds back into this whole issue about what we keep saying, which is we should be learning the lessons of the past. And the industry seems to be stuck in Groundhog Day, I'm afraid. All too often, even now, when you have a project and a large dispute at the end of the project, the legal team with all the experts offer to feed back to the employer and his team or her team the lessons that we can see that could be learned. And all too often, they're just simply not interested. So we need to learn the lessons of the past and do something, and listen and do something about them. But I do wonder there. But the CRUX report is great because it's telling us all about projects that go wrong. But there will be, you know, perhaps you can give me the statistic of how many projects actually are right, and actually capturing data about successful projects and why people think they were successful is a key data set that will be of real use if we're going to be starting to use the data that's fed into with generative AI to get things out, you know, because otherwise we know what it is. You know what in, you know what out. You know, that will be really important. So if we're just focused totally on things that go wrong, that is not necessarily the answer. We need to be focusing our attention very much on gathering and feeding back the data of what projects, projects that go right. And what we mean by go right and success. You know, is it everyone's made a profit? Is it was on time? It means so many things to so many people. But perhaps put it out there, that would be a really interesting thing for HKA to perhaps look for in the future, because unfortunately forewarned is forearmed, but the forewarning doesn't seem to be working.
So we only have a few minutes left here. I think I mean, we have some interesting questions here, but I guess what I'd like to ask you all, why don't we, Caroline, since we're thinking about the future and where we're going to be going, why don't you give us your predictions as to what will be in next year's, the next CRUX report that we see, looking back. I think this generative AI might be a topic that we might want to, might be more apparent. The CRUX report does indicate that it's beginning to see some use in companies. Companies are bringing it with, you know, they're doing their own siloed systems. using some of the AI. John, what do you think that we're going to see in the next CRUX? We're now forewarned, but do you have any forewarning as to the next CRUX report, and where behavior might be changing or evolving?
You know, you read the last few CRUX reports, and it almost feels like I'm reading the same report year on year. So what I'm hoping to see in the next one is actually we've turned a corner. People are working together, and productivity has gone through the roof, and for all the lawyers in the room, you know, workload's gone down at the post contract, but pre-contract it's gone up because we're actually planning to succeed.
Okay, Caroline, what would you like to see in the next CRUX report, realistically?
Well, if it's realistic, and let's start with small steps. I mean, I would love to see employers like John really driving through their teams the importance of contract administration, because I mean, it's just unforgivable the extent to which we've gone through the whole process, and actually poor administration of contracts can lead to disputes because things aren't grappled with early enough. And so often, if anything is dealt with early, it avoids a big battle at the end. And whether it's early neutral evaluation, whether it's use of disputes boards, whether it's adjudication in the UK, that would be really good. But don't make life easy for people by poor admin. It's one of those things I just don't understand. And it's in the hands of the consultants, and they really should be trained to do better. So that's the one area I would really like to see it drop from 20 to 0 or 5%. But I'm not very hopeful, like John, I'm afraid. We see the same things year on year.
We'll be looking for that. Daph, Caroline will be looking for that to see if that improves in the next CRUX report. Daph, what would you like to see in the next CRUX report?
I think what I'd like to see and what we will see are probably two very different things. So I suspect what we will see is a really similar report to this year's. And unfortunately, I think with the state of the economy, both in Britain and across the world now, I suspect that claims might be going up as the belt gets tightened, and so does the attitudes and behaviours. So I suspect it might get worse before it gets better. I think we'll probably also see an uptick in the amount of technological disputes or technologically based disputes. I think that's probably going to be a key area. But you know, I'd like to take John's optimistic view of the world that, you know, we've been talking about this long enough. Surely at some point we'll turn the corner, and actually everyone will see the light. And actually, you know, we have an internal joke which is from the advisory business is trying to put the HKA claims business out of business, but I suspect I'll never be that successful because the way that the industry is stacked. So I think unfortunately more of the same.
Great. And Michelle, well, I don't know, what do you think we will see, and what would you like to see in the next CRUX report?
Yeah, I think what we're going to see in the next CRUX report is, I think we're going to see more COVID, believe it or not, more COVID claims coming out in the next CRUX report, because we still haven't really seen those in the earlier CRUX reports. And from a lot of the work that I'm doing, we're still seeing claims, and you know, they're coming to dispute now, which have got that COVID and Ukraine price escalation element of it. I think that's what we're going to see in the next one. Much of the same, but then drawing out on more of these COVID and price escalation claims. What I'd like to see is upskilling of the labour force and more women in the labour force as well. So, you know, that's what I'd like to see, but it's going to take a long time, I think, a few years to get there at least.
Well, thank you all. Thank you all. That's I think all of those are great ideas that we can look for in the next CRUX report. Given that we've been forewarned. And I hope everybody found today's session has forearmed them quite well. So perhaps with this information, we will see these your ideas make it into the next one. So thank you very much, everybody. Sandra, I know we're a minute over.